Stanford University.
This program is brought to you by the Stanford Humanities Center. For more information, please visit us at shc.stanford.edu.
Hello, I'm Aaron Rodriguez, the director of the Stanford Humanities Center, and I'm delighted to welcome you tonight to this evening's presidential lecture by Michael Ignatieff. The Stanford Presidential Lectures in Humanities and Arts are sponsored by the Office of the President and administered by the Stanford Humanities Center. For more information about the series and to find about our other lectures, you can visit our website at shc.stanford.edu. Now, after Professor Ignatieff's lecture this evening, we'll have time for a few questions and answers. But before the lecture, I would like to invite, I turn to my colleague, Jack Rakoff, who is the William Robertson Co-Professor of History and American Studies and Professor of Political Science. Jack.
Well, thanks very much, Aaron. So Michael Ignatieff, who I've actually known for 40-some years, is lecturing tonight on partisanship, enemies, and adversaries in politics. For me, this is the second occasion I've had to introduce a presidential lecture in this very distinguished series at Stanford, always hosted by the Humanities Center. The first one was actually an easy occasion. That was for Drew Faust, who's now the president of Harvard, and in a sense, I can't say Michael's future boss, but future supervisor in some general sense. Introducing Drew was easy because Drew I've known since college, and we're fellow historians and whose fields are fairly close together. So that was easy. If when Aaron approached me about doing the introduction tonight, I had taken a serious look at what Michael Ignatieff has done in the years since we first met as first-year graduate students in history at Harvard, I think I would have begged off the task immediately. It is just... if we were to start, we could actually spend all of the next hour simply discussing Michael Ignatieff's qualifications, the range of his interests, the range of his achievements, the way in which he's moved almost seamlessly from one sphere to another. To someone like myself, or I think anybody who was just trained as a historian tout simple, it's absolutely mind-boggling. I can think really of no other career for a person our age, and I noted that Michael is actually 3 weeks older than I am, and about 3 weeks younger than Mitt Romney. This 47 was a somewhat interesting year in some ways. We could go on simply spending the next hour describing everything Michael has done. That, of course, would be a great mistake because he has some important and interesting things to say to us tonight. But I want to confess straight off that I find this whole task absolutely overwhelming. And the simplest proof of this, because I did what everybody in this situation always does, I went to Wikipedia to see what's new. Our students do it, and once in a while we can do it ourselves. And it just goes on and on and on. It's just an incredible list of books and roles and teaching assignments and everything else. So I'll say in passing, Michael has taught at the Kennedy School, he's taught at Oxford, he's taught at Cambridge. God knows how many other places he's lectured. It's just fabulous. I have some evidence of my early acquaintance with Michael Nadia. I'd be surprised for him to see this, but I am actually the owner of his first book, A Just Measure of Pain, which I picked up for $6.50, so you can tell I must have bought it some time ago, given the price. As I'm sure many of you know, it deals with the issue of the invention of the penitentiary essentially in Britain, after 1750. When we started graduate school in 1969, there was actually a hot topic. And one of the things I remember best from my opening course, the graduate core colloquium in American history, was the book that everybody was most interested to talk about at that time was David Rothman's book, The Discovery of the Asylum. In certain ways, I think Michael Ignatieff's first book is a kind of English, British parallel to that book. The publication of that book, which is essentially a very good book, but your historian's standard first monograph, was really one of the prelude to the spectacularly wide-ranging career and extraordinarily productive career that has followed. After a couple of years teaching at the University of British Columbia, Michael went off to England, took up a fellowship at King's College. Since then, he's evolved, this is a short list of his accomplishments, he's evolved into a leading journalist, a novelist, a television documentarian, a public intellectual of the first rank, a commentator on an array of pressing problems, notably including international human rights, the morality and efficacy of wars of intervention, including the tragedy of the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s, and our own contemporary war on terror. He's also been, he's a fiction writer. I mean, what other historian could you say, to use that famous English expression, he's been shortlisted for the Booker Prize. Didn't quite win it, but being shortlisted is obviously an eminent achievement by itself. As I'm sure almost everybody here knows, he also became a member of the Canadian Parliament. He became the leader of the Liberal Party, which was, at least for some time, the official opposition party, meaning the number 2 party in the Canadian hierarchy. It's since seen its power eclipsed, and unfortunately that eclipse took place under Michael's chairmanship of the party. As a commentator and a politician, Michael has therefore had to cope with reverses as well as successes. Many of you know, and this is not an obscure matter, many of his admirers were disappointed by his support for the American intervention in Iraq, an issue obviously of some controversy here in 2003 and since. And as I noted, his tenure at the Liberal Party ended with its own deep political collapse in the 2011 federal election, where Michael lost his own seat. Now, these are tough things to have to endure. Losing an election is always tough. And when you're the head of the party, perhaps it's even tougher. I'd like to think, and I'd be curious to know what Michael thinks about this, that being a historian gives you some advantage. It does give you some sense of perspective. It reminds you daily that that the present as well as the past is always contingent. That things never quite turn out as we wholly expect. And so I'd like to think that having the professional training, and I don't mean this in the narrow sense of the term, having historian sensibility would itself be a kind of a powerful weapon to have on occasions like this. So I can go on in this vein and say more about the various books Michael has written and the different prizes for which he's been shortlisted or listed or even won. But I think really it's beyond me, and we couldn't possibly summarize in a short time. So I thought what I would do something just very briefly instead is to try to characterize Michael Ignatieff as I've come to think about him, over the past 4 decades. He strikes me from what is actually a fairly modest acquaintance between us as being perhaps the single most cosmopolitan scholar and commentator whom I can readily identify. And I want to explain what this concept of cosmopolitanism means to me, at least in the context of presenting this talk tonight. First, I think something important to say for an American audience. Michael does have an interesting advantage in being a Canadian. One, because the notion of Canadians, what is their national identity? What does it mean to be a Canadian? In some ways raises very difficult, perhaps tougher questions than it tends to do for Americans. But secondly, what I think is interesting about this, and again, something I think that Americans, meaning U.S. citizens, don't normally think about. When you're Canadian, when you look beyond your own borders, you can actually move in 2 directions. There is London, there is England, there is Oxbridge, there's the old imperial connection, which is very attractive, and which Canadians think about very naturally, I think, as a source of intellectual stimulation reinforcement in a way that Americans don't. And at the same time, there's the great superpower, our beloved land, thriving south of the border. And the striking thing I think about Michael Ignatieff's career is the way in which, and I don't mean this in a manipulative sense, but the way in which having a kind of triangular relationship between Canadian origins, imperial attachments to Britain, and the attraction of the United States, crossing the St. Lawrence or whatever, I think has really been a kind of powerful intellectual engine for him. It's given him a kind of a variety of perspectives, which he's absorbed and assimilated and applied to different questions. So that's the first example of being a cosmopolitan. My second, I think, is Michael is extraordinarily cosmopolitan in terms of his own family history, and one can't really talk about him in any serious sense without saying something about that. I hope this doesn't sound unfair, but Michael is in many ways a product of 2 ruling classes in terms of his genealogy. On one side, he descends from a line of Russian nobility, several of whom held high office under the Tsar, and then who became what might be called white Russian refugees after the Bolshevik Revolution and the Civil War that followed. If you know his book about his Russian family, the Russian album, which came out in 1987, quarter of a century ago, reading that book seems to me a bit like reading E.H. Carr's book, which I read my first year in graduate school, Romantic Exiles, about the liberal 19th century Russian exiles grouped around Alexander Herzen. and their story of what it's like to live in Europe, exiled from life under the Tsar. On his mother's side, Michael descends as well from an equally prominent family with a significant record of public service in the history of Canada. And its experience is captured in the second book, True Patriot Love, 4 Generations in Search of Canada, which came out 20 years later after the first book. So I got a second sense of cosmopolitanism. It's hard for me to know what this means, but I think in a certain sense it means, Michael was born to a life of public service with 2 very different genealogies there, but each, I think, exerting a powerful sway on who he is. The third sense in which I think Michael is a cosmopolitan embraces his intense involvement in the values and practices of human rights, that great subject of the modern political consciousness. This has become, for people in the 21st century, this has become our version of the 18th century's great concern with sympathy, the moral problem that so engaged Adam Smith, and which, of course, at the Stanford Humanities Center, we can always also associate with the legacy of its first director, Ian Watt, and his work on the rise of the novel. And I've always like to tell my students, reading the novel as an 18th century project is essentially entering into the 18th century world of thinking about the nature of human sympathy. What does it mean to enter into someone else's life and to feel some sense of attachment and concern? Writing about human rights, it seems to me, in our period, is an extension of that concern with sympathy. And I think Michael has probably expressed his sympathy most directly in the ways in which he's thought about the national conflicts of recent decades and the case to be made for, perhaps against, American involvements overseas. But it's also affected much of his other work. Finally, there's one last thing I want to say about Michael, and this is a personal note which you won't find in Wikipedia, but which I know something about. It's alluded to, but doesn't really quite figure in the preface to A Just Measure of Pain. So when we were in graduate school back in the early 1970s, for anybody who was alive at that time, one of the most powerful and traumatic events of that period was the prison upheaval at Attica in 1971, which ended horrifically with the death, by something like, I think, 44 prisoners, and some number including, or 44 victims, most prisoners, but also including some of the guards who have been held hostage. This is if you watch the nightly news as we did in those days, somewhat different from following the news today. This was an event that really imprinted itself on American consciousness, in a very powerful and very disturbing way. It's the subject of a great book by Tom Wicker, who got involved in it. What Michael doesn't mention in his book is that he led a group of graduate students at Harvard. And I think this took place more or less as his ideas for his own academic project were formulating. But Michael became part of a group of graduate students at Harvard. I think included our mutual friends Alex Kazar and John Prude. I think we're part of that group. I wasn't one of them, so I'm not claiming any credit here. But Michael and this group went off to the Walpole Prison, which is essentially in suburban Boston, and did something similar. I think they were there in part to reassure prisoners about their own security at a time when prison discipline in the United States was particularly rocky and difficult. And I think in part it led to, if I remember correctly, it led to tutoring projects and similar kinds of activities. Why do I mention this point? Because I think what it testifies to most powerfully is that at a very early stage in his career, for many or most of us, and certainly including myself, could possibly have thought in these terms, Michael was developing an element of sympathy, which in a sense became the starting point for the very distinguished and just extraordinarily accomplished public career that has followed. So his subject tonight is very different. It's actually, the title here is on Partisanship, Enemies and Adversaries in Politics. He told me he's actually going to discuss my alter ego, from whose house I've literally just returned, James Madison. Had he told me this in advance, I'd probably have written a much different introduction. But I'm fairly happy with the one I presented. And so without further ado, I'm really happy to introduce Michael Ignatieff.
Thank you so much for being here, and thank you, Jack, for such a kind and generous introduction. It does a man's heart good to see his first book waved in front of his eyes. It was called A Just Measure of Pain, which is a pretty good description of what a political career is like. And I'm particularly grateful for his evocation of those tumultuous and difficult hours in a Walpole prison. I saw the American justice system at its worst. I saw American courage and virtue at its best. I was very touched that you evoked that memory, because it was a very important part of my development as a thinking person. I want to get at this. I want to thank you all for coming. I didn't think anybody would show up, so I feel relieved and happy. I've been an academic and I've been a politician. I've been a professor and a politician, and not everybody is as foolish to try to be both. I certainly think it was foolish to try to be both, but it does give me a certain perspective that I hope will be useful about partisanship and about our political system, because I can see the problem of partisanship both from the inside as a politician and now once again as a voter, as a citizen. And that's where I want to start, how differently politicians and citizens see the democratic system, and how differently each of them see the issue of partisanship, which is at the center of my talk. For politicians, partisanship is the essence of politics. That's what you do it for. You win power by accentuating your positives, accentuating their negatives, and seeking to exacerbate divisions and promising voters a bright tomorrow if you're elected. For most voters, on the other hand, partisanship is exactly what they hate about politics. The negative attack ads, the emphasis on division over disagreement, over agreement, and those endless promises of new dawns that never seem to arise. I mean, in a fundamental sense, our democratic system is divided into two. There's the media bubble where the political class lives and where partisanship rules, and there's the world outside of that where ordinary voters live their lives. And they're two different realms. And this alienation between voters and their own political system, I think, has widened into what I would call a crisis of representation. And what I mean by a crisis of representation is, first of all, that parties do not represent the people who vote for them adequately, sense one of the crisis of representation. Sense two, neither party represents the reality that their country faces. So it's in that double sense that I'm using the idea of a crisis of representation. But it's at this point, because I'm still in the days when I was an honest man, I was a historian, as Jack says, and being a historian makes me realize that if you're going to use the word crisis, you better be very careful. Because partisanship and disgust with partisanship has been a feature of democratic life since the beginning of the American Republic. And that's where Madison comes in, and only a damn fool would talk about Madison in the presence of the greatest expert in the United States about Madison. So I beg Jack's indulgence here. But Madison has had a great effect on me as a thinker and writer, and you can't read 10th Federalist without remembering Madison's warning about faction, the danger posed to democracy by faction, political parties serving their own interests rather than the people's, inflaming divisions rather than bringing citizens together. The point about beginning with Madison is that it reminds us that keeping partisanship under control has been the business of this democracy since the very beginning. And keeping partisanship under control is citizens' work, as Madison saw it, and has been from the beginning. Democracy is built on a healthy distrust of politicians and their partisan games. And I guess what I'm saying about today is that healthy distrust of politics has passed into active loathing of politicians. And disillusion is sometimes so general that it sometimes seems the only way to get yourself elected in this country is to pretend not to be a politician at all, or to run against the system, or to run against Washington. Well, the problem with that stuff is you can try it, but once you start pretending that you're not a politician, it has the effect of driving voters away, and driving them away not only from you, but away from the system. And you get the feeling that if politicians don't start sticking up for the democratic system itself and always try to run against it, voters aren't going to stick up for their democracy much either. And when you look at the facts of democratic participation in the United States, but also in my own country, it's clear that voters have been walking away from democracy for 2 generations. Voter participation rates in all democratic societies have declined markedly since 1960. In my country, from about nearly 80% turnouts in 1960 to just above 55% now in 2010. 1 in 5 voters age 18 who turned 18 and the federal election in Canada in 2008, 1 in 5 bothered to vote at all. You can begin to imagine a Canadian election in which we have an election and nobody shows up. Not so good. And one of the things that when you talk to young people about this, they say, they're all liars, voting doesn't make any difference, and the change I believe in is personal, not political. Change my own life, but I'm not going to change anybody else's life. And that pathology is a sign of voters walking away from their own democracy. And one phenomenon, one aspect of that is the sense in which what they hate most about democracy is partisan, about what they hate most about their politics is partisan rhetoric. They accept some partisanship is inevitable, but that excessive kind, the shrill ideological hostility, the permanent campaigns fought with negative attack ads, the refusal to compromise, the legislative gridlock, all of it is turning voters off their own system. It's also making it much more difficult to govern. This is a standard feature of the story, but it's an important one. If you start treating all your political opponents as enemies, it becomes very difficult to put together the compromises that make a legislative democracy work. This is a theme that Dennis Thompson and Amy Gutman have brought out. Partisanship is also hastening the flight of voters away from political parties themselves. 1/3 of American voters now don't identify with either party, identify themselves as independents in order to differentiate themselves from straightforward political partisanship. And party membership is declining, not just in America, but in all democracies. And that means you have voters that are both more volatile in their electoral choices, less stable in their electoral choices, but also more disengaged from the very business of choosing. Now, what voters are saying, what they said to me, is when you formalize their loathing of politics, they're telling me that partisanship is, first of all, a failure of representation. Politicians do not truly represent voters. They put their own party interests first. They describe reality in ways that suit their own case, and they use power to feather their own nests. Now, Madison comes back in at this point because he offers us comfort. He offers us a remedy. He says you can always throw the rascals out. What makes the current situation a crisis is that we keep throwing the rascals out and they keep crawling back in. So the system that should clear is not clearing, and that is one of the reasons I think we can speak of a crisis. So partisanship is a failure of representation, but it's also a failure to describe reality accurately. One of the things that people say to me about partisanship is that it's intellectually dishonest. Politicians put the party line ahead of truth, and they become the sophists that Greek philosophers warned us about 2,000 years ago. Partisanship is therefore a failure to represent reality, political reality, adequately and truthfully. Now, at this point, my political experience may be of some use because the working role morality of politicians on the question of truth is significantly and interestingly different. Politicians will always tell you, truth is good, but not all truth is good to say. Why hurt people's feelings? Why alienate people when you don't need to? And what's so bad about telling people what they want to hear? Role morality as politicians use it is just different. Anyone, and this is from personal experience, who's fought an election with a party line that isn't working has to learn to bite your tongue. and any politician who's ever lived has had to sell a lot of snake oil, including yours truly. I mean, what that means is that the role morality of politics puts a premium on loyalty over honesty. It puts a premium on taking one for the team as opposed to sticking up for what you believe, and telling stories rather than telling it like it is. For those who believe that the essence of the political vocation is to speak truth to power, this situation and the role morality that goes with it is worse than a dingy necessity. It's just unacceptable. But here, again, I want to come back to Madison. I think this burdens a politician with a moral obligation he can't possibly carry. One of the great moments in the Federalist 51, as I recall it, is Madison telling us, we need government and we need politicians because we're not angels. It's a great and resonant thought. And it means that we have to have a certain kind of moral realism about the role morality that's particular to the political vocation. And the same message of moral realism that you hear in Madison, you also hear in the greatest lecture ever given about politics, which is Max Weber's Politics as a Vocation, written in 1918, which many of you know. Those, he said, who put conscience first in politics were practicing what he called an ethic of ultimate ends. And against an ethic of ultimate ends, Weber posited, as you know, an ethic of responsibility. What I discovered is that once you're responsible to an electorate, you can't accomplish anything if you value your own conscience more highly than you value the team that got you there. No political party, this is the hard stuff, no political party can survive without partisan discipline, without actively suppressing the ethic of ultimate ends in its own followers. A party can't win power if everyone is morally freelancing. Now, I take this line because this is precisely what people hate most about politics, and especially young voters hate about politics. They believe that politics ought to serve an ethic of ultimate ends, and I came to understand in political life that in politics you have to be what is called strategic, balancing claims of conscience against the party line. And that means from time to time you have to take one for the team. And it means from time to time you can't make a moral spectacle of yourself on every issue that arises. And so that means that humility and discipline are the things you have to learn when you go into politics, and all that's just fine. But if you sacrifice your conscience to the party line once too often, you end up becoming someone who can't tell what the truth is at all, or ceases to care what it is at all. And so if you don't balance the claims that Weber asked us to balance, ethics of ultimate ends versus ethics of responsibility, you end up becoming a hack. And it's not nice to become a hack, and it's not nice to believe that you have become a hack. And in that, there is salvation. There's no politician alive who likes to think of himself as a hack. And that's an important source of how we keep politicians on the right side of conscience. But here, too, voters can be a big help. Voters can help politicians stay honest by rewarding those who put principle first, even when it means going against their own voters' interest. Doesn't happen very often that voters reward a politician who votes against a voter's interest. But if they did it a little more often, we'd have more principle in politics. It takes two, in other words, to keep a political system honest. Politicians who keep their words, and then voters, you, demanding that it happen. The problem is that more and more voters believe that politicians are so far gone that they can't possibly heed the call of principle. And if you believe that, and if voters believe that, you get the politicians you deserve. I mean, what I'm saying here is a little controversial. It's that a lot of the blame for what's happened to our politics is strictly on the shoulders of politicians. I take the rap. But some of the problem lies with voters themselves. And there's a type of disillusioned voter, especially prevalent among young people, who have expectations of honesty, clarity and principle that no human being can possibly attain. Again, to quote Madison, we're not angels. None of us are angels, and we shouldn't ask our politicians to be ones either. I'm trying to make the controversial argument that politics is a morally questionable profession, and it's entitled to respect precisely because it is. Citizens can demand and should demand honesty, accountability, and proper use of public office from their politicians, but I'm not sure that they can expect perfect responsibility towards the truth. Because leadership, political leadership, and everybody's calling for political leadership, means making tough calls in equivocal situations where the truth is complex. Leadership means deciding in uncertainty without adequate facts, and then being willing to live with the consequences wherever they lead. We all, I think, struggle with the fact that we started in childhood with ideas of leadership that simply don't correspond to what leadership actually is. We think that they ride white horses. We think that they're pure as the driven snow. But democracy actually has to function without white knights, and it can't function at all unless there are men and women prepared to get their hands dirty and take responsibility for getting their hands dirty. So moral perfectionism and an easy contempt for politicians is making our crisis of representation worse than it need to be. We need to be moral realists about democracy, and if we were, we might get an occasional politician who would be actually better than we deserve. My own experience of this is, and I'm sailing upstream here, it isn't easy, but my own experience of politics was that it was the moral hazards that made political life fascinating. You do it because it puts you at risk. That's why you do it. And you put yourself at risk and you take those moral risks because, frankly, there's no noble end that does not entail putting yourself in harm's way. So that's the first thing I want to say. It's a plea for the moral realism that we hear in Madison, the moral realism that we hear in Weber, and a plea that we disinfest ourselves of the kind of easy contempt for politicians that seems to dog all forms of hope in politics and are currently, I think, dogging the re-election chances of the current president. Let me move to a second theme here, which is a rather different one. The other thing that voters tell me about partisanship is that it's phony. The heated exchanges in TV shows and on the floor of the legislature are shows that are both insincere and false. And what's wrong with partisanship on this line of attack is that it manufactures a distinction where there's no real difference. Here the argument is that for all the shouts and alarms of partisan bickering between parties, the actual differences, the policy differences between parties may actually be quite minor. More spending versus less, tougher policies on crime versus softer ones, more generous policies on welfare versus less. And voters sense that they're being told there are massive differences, archetypal differences between political offerings, when in fact they know that when these guys get into office, the pressure of reality itself will force these ideological opposites back closer towards the center. The problem with partisanship on this account is that it creates differences where there's no real distinction. And related to that is the idea that ideological differentiation in American politics has only a tenuous relation to the reality that the country actually faces. I mean, it's fanciful to suppose that America's problems or Canada's problems would be solved if we just got government off people's backs. But it's an equal fantasy to suppose that government is the solution to every problem. Real solutions in practical political life are detail-driven and they're constrained by facts. And good policy usually balances some form of government action with some incentive to private initiative, and all of it is shaped in conditions of austerity, scarcity, and fiscal constraint. Some people argue, and Thomas Byrne Edsel would be an example of this, that it's the scarcity constraints that are making partisanship so extreme in American politics. There's no question that scarcity, austerity, fiscal constraint is making partisanship worse, but I would argue that American politics has been partisan in the fat years as well as the lean ones. And in fact, you could argue that having to make do with less ought to bring us together just as much as it appears to be driving us apart. So I don't see the connection between partisanship and fiscal austerity that others do. Other commentators like Thomas Frank of Pity the Poor Billionaire, wonderful title, have argued that growing partisanship in American politics reflects the growing inequality between the rich, empowered, and educated few and the struggling middle class many. American politics is partisan and bitterly divided because American society is bitterly divided. On this account, partisanship is in fact a true reflection of reality. The problem here is not that partisanship doesn't reflect reality, it reflects it only too well. You see, I don't buy that argument either, because I think that no political party actually has a stable interest in representing either side in the class war. The interesting thing is that neither side has an interest in representing a particular side in the class war, because if they do, they lose votes. I mean, just take the current Republican candidate. He may actually believe that 47% of the country are welfare dependents. That probably means most of this room, right? Unbelievable statement. But it would be a disaster for him if this were to stick. And so you'll see him, and you saw him in the debate last week, claiming energetically that he wants everyone in his tent and wants to serve everyone if elected. Class war politics doesn't work for him at all, but it doesn't, interestingly, work any better for the Democrats. They may believe, as a matter of reality, or their vision of reality, that the rich are getting richer and the middle class are being left behind, and I certainly think that is true. But as a partisan political matter, in terms of their rhetoric, they take extraordinary care, and you see this in Obama's speeches, to make sure that they don't alienate the job creators. In other words, no one has a vested stake in describing the social reality as class war. They've all walked back from it, and that means that political parties mask rather than reveal social divisions, and they do so in the interest of maximizing their appeal. The cost, however, is that voters doubt, I think especially the voters in this room, doubt that political debate actually represents the society they see before their eyes. Politics is theater, and it's asking a lot that it should accurately represent social division. The sober presentation of reality as it is will always be at a disadvantage when people come out for a good show. But one of the things, however theatrical and exaggerated any campaign becomes, once one side wins and has to govern, governing itself tempers partisanship in office. The simplicities of ideology rarely stand the fiery trial of reality. And so again, democracy potentially offers us a remedy for partisanship. Voters can throw rascals out. They can throw out those whose story fails to correspond to reality. I want to put some emphasis on this because I'm very struck by the number of people who have come to the conclusion that voters are simply captives of partisan rhetoric. What struck me being in politics is the deep truth of you can fool people some of the time, but you can't fool them all of the time. And if we lose that sense of our democracy, we really are done for. We put a lot of emphasis in politics on storytelling, and we reward good storytellers. We don't say enough that stories have to correspond to the lived realities of the voters you're seeking to persuade. There's some basic epistemological accountability built into democracy which we ignore at our peril. There's a rough and ready correspondence theory of truth built into the heart of democracy, and I as a politician saw it in work. If the story you tell doesn't connect to the reality that voters have lived, they will not vote for it, no matter how persuasive, enchanting, and eloquent it is. And that, it seems to me, is absolutely the one crucial escape from partisanship that democracy offers us. Of course, politicians will tell you what you want to hear. They airbrush out disagreeable features of reality, their own record, play up the disagreeable features of their opponents, but their story must bear some discernible relationship to voters' reality for voters to vote for it. It's true that political partisanship constructs reality. It's true that politics is smoke and mirrors. But people, you people, do not live in a funhouse. You live in the real world, the world that's real to you. And such rational choice as you exercise occurs when you compare the smoke and mirrors that's on offer to the reality you actually live day by day. This is not to deny that it's tough to figure out what is real for you. And it's especially tough in view of politicians' willful attempts to create distinctions where there's no real difference. One of my favorite passages in Sigmund Freud is about the narcissism of minor difference. The theory that the smaller the real differences between opponents, the larger these differences will loom in their imagination. Freud's theory captures the falsity of partisanship, but it also helps to explain how partisanship over minor differences can escalate into real hatred. Differences that outsiders barely recognize can lead insiders to reach for each other's throats. Again, a realistic evaluation of this would have to confess that if you're in political life, you have to be the master of the narcissism of minor difference. You just have to. You have to be able to create distinctions where there's no real difference. But at the same time, and equally, you have to tell a story that connects with what voters believe to be true. So all politicians, by definition, by the structure of what they do, have to face both ways at once. And the trick is to face both ways without appearing to be two-faced. By which I mean, you got to throw red meat to partisans. And a politician who fails to throw red meat to partisans just looks like a fool. At the same time, you have to reach beyond the partisan base to the non-aligned, the floating independent voters who want to feel they're spoken to, not spoken at. And given the rising number of those voters, many of whom would be in the room tonight, it does not pay to condescend to their demand for arguments that convince. So any politician worth his salt has to be partisan with his partisans and then rise above party to reach the unattached voter. He has to be simultaneously in the battle and above the fray. I'm trying to get you to understand how difficult it is to be an effective politician. And this constant conflict of roles and constant conflict of audiences make it interesting. And the few geniuses, and I certainly was no genius at this, but the few geniuses at this business manage to fuse two roles. They're fighters and fathers, brawlers and seers, politicians and leaders in one wonderful package. Putting it slightly more less exalted language, there's a wonderful old Scottish politician who put it this way: a man who can't ride two bloody horses at once has no right to a job in the circus. And that's a motto for me in politics. I certainly didn't find riding the two horses very easy. Now, let me go to a third aspect of the discussion of partisanship. If partisanship were merely a kind of circus trick, riding two horses at once, the worst that could be said is that it's a poor show. But voters' problems with partisanship go a lot deeper. Partisanship actively frightens voters. Partisanship divides an already divided society and turns adversaries into enemies. And I want to say something about the distinction that seems to me important between adversaries and enemies. An enemy is someone who must be destroyed. An adversary is someone who must be defeated. An enemy does not share your ultimate loyalties. An adversary is someone you disagree with, but whose loyalties you do not question. You cannot compromise with enemies. To do so would be to betray your principles. But with adversaries, you can not only agree to disagree, you can become an ally tomorrow. With an adversary, compromise is always possible. And behind this distinction between enemies and adversaries lies another distinction, even more important and basic, between politics and war. War is a battle between enemies. Politics is a competition between adversaries. War, Clausewitz said, is the continuation of politics by other means. But politics is not the continuation of war, but the alternative to war. This is an obvious point, but believe me, if we lose the distinction between enemies and adversaries in politics, partisanship goes completely out of control. And we have a lot of instruments in modern democracy that try to keep us understanding our opponents as adversaries. In parliamentary democracies where I serve, the party opposing the government is called the loyal opposition. The opposition performs an adversarial function critical to democracy itself, and governments have no business questioning the loyalty of those who oppose them. When legislators take their oath of office in your Congress and in my Parliament, they swear allegiance to the common rules of the democratic game, and common oath swearing is designed to strengthen that shared loyalty between adversaries. And all of these rituals are designed to make sure that opponents treat each other as adversaries and not as enemies. And in the old days, before I got into Parliament, people would say that adversaries in politics used to drink together. They used to go out together. They used to dine together. These rituals of civility kept adversaries from becoming enemies. And the fraternity of adversaries is one of the oddities of democratic life that seems to me absolutely crucial to hold on to. And the fraternity of adversaries means you roast someone in debate, you knock them around in public, and then you take them out for a drink afterwards. It's a very weird, counterintuitive way of living with people, but it's absolutely crucial to democratic civility. The health of democratic debate depends on the assumption that the ultimate loyalties of those who compete for office are not open to question. This is the minimum mutual recognition that sets a limit to partisanship. And from this act of recognition flows a premise of good faith. You reject arguments, not persons. You question premises, not identities. You interrogate interests. You don't question loyalties. Again, in theory, democratic disagreement ought not to be personal because the cause you defend is not personal. It's the cause of those who elected you. And you avoid getting personal in democratic argument because you want to persuade someone. We've lost the centrality of persuasion in democratic argument. And you accept an adversary's good faith, if only as a rhetorical gambit, because you want to win them over. And the very attempt to persuade your adversary implies that your adversary is open, free to decide on the merits of the case. And it's at this point that modern party discipline, as I've experienced it, brings its dead hand to play. Modern party discipline is so oppressive that there are very few opponents left who are actually free to be persuaded. And discipline is the enemy of democratic persuasion. So that when party whips dictate how votes will go in a legislative chamber in advance, persuasion loses its point and servility loses its rationale. When political partisanship rules, you're always preaching to the converted. You're never trying to convert someone. You're never reaching across to the other side. When persuasion loses its pivotal role, debate becomes ritualized and pointless, and nothing lowers a citizen's estimate of democracy anywhere in the world than going to your democratic assembly and seeing two politicians in a nearly empty chamber hurling ritual abuse at each other. But believe me, that is what it's like to visit democratic assemblies the world over. And you mustn't think that America has the worst examples of partisanship on offer. We got some terrible ones, on display in Canada. As power ebbs away from legislatures and accrues steadily to the executive and the permanent bureaucracy, legislatures replace relevance with partisanship, party discipline rules supreme, fraternization is frowned upon, negotiation and compromise are rarely practiced, and debate within chambers becomes as venomously personal as it becomes politically meaningless. And democratic peoples have good reason to fear this phenomenon, waning legislative democracy and heightened partisanship, because taken together they could actually threaten democracy's key role. And its key role is enabling us to live together, enabling people who disagree to work together. Now, if excessive partisanship is seen as the disease, civility is widely seen as the cure. I'm often told when I was in politics to be more polite, but I don't think the issue is politeness. The issue is recognition, whether you accept that your adversary's loyalty is equal to your own. A politics of adversaries requires not good manners, but good faith. And that means you cannot model political competition as war, except as a cost to democratic politics itself. And the language of war, which is extremely prevalent in modern politics, is the language of democracy's enemies, not its friends. Lenin said, Vladimir Ilyich said that the only question in politics was whom, hammer or anvil. In Leninist politics, the goal is not to defeat your opponents, but to obliterate them as the class enemy. The Nazi theorist Carl Schmitt, writing in the 1930s, said the key division in politics was friend and foe, them and us. But when you see politics that way, you see politics as war, and you therefore see German society at the time as a battlefield between true Germans and lesser beings ultimately deserving of extermination. So it's in fascism that you see the fatal step from a politics of adversaries to a politics of enemies. We're not there yet. Our politics is robust, our disagreements are visceral, but we are a long way from fascism. Let's be clear about that. But we should look at what happened in Weimar. It's not impossible. It happened that fatal declension occurred in a democracy not so dissimilar to our own, in a society plagued by economic crisis, among a battered population looking for someone to blame. Democracy's health depends on holding firm, even in economic crisis and decline, to the rule that opponents are adversaries, citizens just like you. So to recognize an adversary is to recognize and acknowledge their standing. Standing has become the chief focus of political combat in modern politics. You no longer argue with what an opponent is saying, you deny their right to be in the ring at all. You don't debate what they say, you try to deny them the right to say anything at all. This, it seems to me, is a fatal area that politics has got into. The most egregious example, of course, was the steady campaign by the birthers to claim that the president was not entitled to his office because he was foreign born. Now, questioning the standing of a sitting president is to treat him as an alien. Fortunately, this attack has been forced out of the mainstream by general outrage from the citizenry, but let's not exclude the possibility that this will have some effect on democratic outcomes. And these types of attack, in which standing, not propositions, becomes the center of democratic debate, become standard operating procedure when political competition is modeled as war. War metaphors are popular with politicians. I've used them myself because war talk raises the stakes, motivates the troops, justifies any and all means. It creates the impression of tough-minded willingness to take the battle to the enemy. And all of this may be insincere displays of bravado and machismo, but it has insidious effects. It legitimizes a take-no-prisoners approach, which encourages us to treat electoral law as something to be honored in the breach rather than the observance. And as Amy Gutman and Dennis Thompson have pointed out, the politics of enemies doesn't just poison campaigns, it makes governing afterwards very difficult. It has the effect, now much remarked in the US Congress, of defining compromise as betrayal. Compromise is the essence of what politicians do. Their business is rarely about winning outright. It's about crafting a deal that is a collective choice of the lesser of two evils. And politicians who trade in compromise for a living understand that an adversary today may well become an ally tomorrow. And here's another place where a disreputable form of moral perfectionism has crept into our understanding of politics. It's crept into our very discussion of compromise, so that we make a misplaced equation between being principled and being uncompromising. And that's a category mistake. You can't run a democracy without a willingness to compromise between adversaries. And to repeat a point, again, I'm going back again and again, perhaps to Jack Rakoff's embarrassment, by citing Madison as an example of moral realism. But Madison would have understood instantly, we have politicians precisely to make the deals the rest of us are too damn fastidious to make ourselves. We need leaders prepared to take moral risks with their own integrity in order to make the deals that keep us together as a people. Of course, not all compromise is honorable. Compromise can slide into appeasement, and when it slides into appeasement, politicians have to say no. And when compromise becomes impossible, it's not the beginning of war, it should be the beginning of an election. The language of war has no place in politics, and the essence of democracy is to keep partisanship in check so that compromise remains possible. We should keep the language of war where it properly belongs, firmly in the domain of international relations, where we do face adversaries who don't play by democratic rules, don't respect the rights we value, and have no permanent incentive to cooperate with democratic peoples. We should focus martial energies where they're needed, to those adversaries who actively threaten the liberty of other peoples and our own. Towards those within our borders, however, towards those with whom we disagree, however heatedly, we should work from one simple but very persuasive conviction. In the house of democracy, there are no enemies. So what's to be done in conclusion? Madison, again, would have encouraged us to seek institutional remedies, and it would be presumptuous for a foreigner, a rank outsider, to make suggestions of how to fix your democracy. So I will simply select from among those that I've heard from able American contemporaries. First, the Founding Fathers, this may be controversial, but I'll say it anyway because Americans are saying it, and so it's not presumptuous. Founding Fathers understood that money is not speech. Money is power. Every Founding Father, I will wager Jack Rakoff could not disagree. Founding Fathers understood that money is power, not speech. And it must be restrained if equal voice on which democracy depends is to be maintained. So I would say if you want to restrain partisanship, Congress can and should overturn Citizens United. Partisanship is inflamed by money, and the fires can be doused by effective campaign reform. And whatever else is wrong in my democracy, and believe me, there's a ton of things wrong, we have got campaign finance right. And let me tell you what it means. It means I can walk into the only time in my life I ever met billionaires was when I was in politics, not surprising. The great thing about campaign finance reform is you can walk into a room with a billionaire and know he can only give you $1,300 in our system. And that it will be receipted. He cannot give it to me in cash. It doesn't go to me. It's on a public website, right? I mean, I can't tell you how liberating that is as a practical political matter. We're not angels, that's the point. And this is a pre-commitment strategy that ties our hands and prevents us getting sullied by money. So I urge campaign finance reform on my American colleagues and friends. Second, as former Congressman Mickey Edwards has suggested, Congress and the state should return to the people the full power to choose their own representatives. Closed party primaries are the problem. They should be replaced with open ones where parties could still endorse candidates, but voters would be able to vote for anyone prepared to stand. Truly open elections, the primary level, would break the power of the small coterie of highly ideological partisans who currently determine who you get to vote for. Third, and this is still more difficult, all of it's difficult, in Congress, the control of party leaders should be cut back to size. Elected representatives should recover the right to vote their conscience and their electors' interests. In a parliamentary system of the kind I'm familiar with, this means votes under party discipline would be restricted to budget and supply, and members would be free to vote on every other measure. This would empower legislators to be true representatives again. It means breaking the power of party leaders, and having been one, I can tell you that won't be easy. But this is the people's business. It's a battle for the people's interest. And if it's a battle for the people's interest, it's a battle that must be won. I'm not going to go further with detail. My point is that we don't need to suffer excessive partisanship, and we can do institutional changes that mean that we do not have to make a crisis of representation worse through the dead hand of party discipline. We, the people, can change this. And if we want it enough, we can make it happen. And that, after all, is what it's all about. That's the very promise of democracy itself. Thank you for your attention.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.